Hello, and welcome to Gaspar's History Podcast. This is Gaspar, and welcome to Episode 11, Meat Hound, Part 3. In our last episode, we heard how Meat Hound was coming into service, and we caught up on the first few missions in March, and how Jones and Steele had to bring the Skywolf back early due to condensation on the turbochargers. We then ended with Steele being told he would assume the left seat in the cockpit for the mission scheduled on March 13th, 1943. Let's add a new mantra to our story. What is your connection to history? Everyone has a connection, you just have to find it. So what is yours? Let's now get the Meat Hound launched and start her tour of duty. It wasn't an ordinary morning for Steele, even though on the surface it looked that way. Because on the surface all the routines were the same, but there was an important detail to note today. Steele had been told he would be the captain today, and Jones would be the co-pilot. It was a role reversal for these two pilots. They had flown 6 missions together, including 3 into Germany and 2 to Saint Nazaire. They had also crashed on takeoff and recently survived a mid-air collision. It feels like they are tempting fate a bit. Steele did not get much sleep, but it wasn't because of where they were flying, because he really did not know yet, but rather he was going to be formally responsible for the young men flying with him today, and that always added some nerves to the stomach. Jones and Steele had survived everything that had been thrown at them, but they were still under 10 missions, so they knew their clock was ticking. Jones was wondering if the recent loss of the Unbearable and the pilot error review from the crash in January was driving the change. Probably not, but who really knows when one is dealing with the Army Air Corps? The fact was, Jones and Steele really didn't care. They were flying together, and they were a team. The briefing room was the same. A bunch of young men with hats askew taking wagers on where the mission was going to be. A lot of them were smoking. Some of the chaps would even be dressed in their ties, clearly a carryover from their parochial school days or simply mama's training. The submarine pens. God, I hope not. Germany? Belgium? The Netherlands? They were all questioning. It was better to wager on Saint Nazaire, because if you were right, at least you won the bet, whereas if you bet on Germany, you not only were having to go to Saint Nazaire, but you were doing so with less money. But you thought, well, if we do go to Saint Nazaire, I really won't be needing any money after the trip anyway. The blue tarp was doing a fine job of covering the objective, and the chatter continued. Drum roll, please. The destination are the marshalling yards at Amiens, France. It was sort of anticlimactic, all this build-up for a milk run. The plan was for the first wing of the 8th Air Force to get 80 B-17s on the marshalling yards at Amiens, and if that was not possible, then let those Abbeville boys have it at JG-26 Airdrome. The plan was for the 91st, 303rd, 305th, and 306th bomb groups to meet their Spitfire fighter squadrons at Dungeness, which is between Hastings and Dover, then head for the French coast and cross at KU, then into Amiens. Steele was thinking how he loves those Spitfires, but he was also wondering if he will see any Spitfires, because their support is promised, but like faith, not always seen. As an aside, the Memphis Belle would be flying today on her 15th mission, while the Meat Hound will be flying her first. Okay, boys, let's get in, hit 'em hard with 6 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs, and then hightail it out of there, a regular milk run. Steele had an adverse reaction to milk run, and he did not believe it for a moment. I mean, the JG-26 air drone is at Abbeville, so part of the mission alone is like taking a swing at the hornet's nest. Remember Romilly Susain? Steele did not believe in milk runs, and they scared him. Whether he had that exact feeling on this morning, I'm not quite sure. But I do know he was not fond of milk runs and did not want to be any part of them. The ride to the Meat Hound was typical, but what was not typical was when Steele and Jones reached the Meat Hound. Her nose art stood out. She was a beauty. She had just arrived and was already involved in a photo shoot by world-famous photographer James Jarchet, the photographer of the royal family, who was enamored by the Meat Hound and took a photograph of replacement gunner Frank Lusick in front of the Meat Hound's nose so that her magnificent artwork could be seen worldwide when it hit the front page of the London Illustrated Times. It was a memory Jones and Steele would recite years later. On this day, my father-in-law was born 90 years ago, so it is only fitting that I add a shout-out to the crew chiefs who handled the Meat Hound. I am not exactly sure which one it was, but be sure George Bright, Henry Balawager, Franklin Turex, Selden Wentworth, or Joseph Tarana were proud of the Meat Hound and had her ready to go for her first day on the job. The old Willis glided into a stop, and Steele and Jones hopped out, surveying the olive drab beauty. Then they climbed in through the back escape hatch, which always made Steele nervous after the, quote, incident almost cut him in half on his first day on the job. But there was no time to dwell on that today. Staff Sergeant James Smoot was in the tail gun position, and Steele was glad that he was. Steele hunched over, past the waist gunners. Staff Sergeant Clarence Durham was one, and a young man Steele was familiar with, and one who also knew how to wear a hat askew. That is for sure. Unbeknownst to Steele or Durham will later participate in a mission as a gunner that sets a record, but more on that later. Next to Durham, manning the right waist gun, is a new face to Steele. Well, not completely new, as everyone knew the squadron artist Don Bevan. Sergeant Bevan is very familiar to our story, and after the war would be known by a great many of the population, since he is the author, well not yet, of Stalag 17, both the play and the movie in which what Hogan's Heroes will be adapted from. Steele did not know he would be tipping his hat to such a celebrity. Standing in the fuselage was another familiar face and a gunner Steele felt good about, Sergeant Piotrowski, the ball turret gunner. In the radio room sat the young man from the Bronx, Ray Stymax. Steele and Stymax were from two different parts of the world, but today they were in the same world, living the same nightmare. Steele continued forward and came upon George McClellan. Steele was used to seeing Banforth, but today McClellan was the engineer and the top turret gunner. Maybe Leon was on a well-deserved leave to Southport. McClellan was a fellow Texan, and so was the navigator, Andrew Simmons, who was from Tyler, Texas, and he had come over with Steele to the 306th on December 11th with the Wigington and Malin crew. The nose of the Meat Hound was Texas heavy on this day. Then there was Sergeant Hull, who was toggling. He had access to the 50 caliber Brownings installed in the nose. He still was not smiling, but maybe he had a smirk. Lastly, Lieutenant Jones was in the right-hand seat today. This was the crew assigned to the Meat Hound on her maiden voyage to Amiens, France. The control tower at Thurley sent up the starcher engine's flare, so it was time to go. It was not an early start, but still early enough, and the mission today would log 4 hours and 25 minutes into the crew's bank that was building towards a new job and a 30-day furlough in the States, if they could make it that long. The routine was the same, even though the Meat Hound was new. Steele and Jones worked their way through the checklist. The crew were at their posts, making final adjustments on their equipment, and prayers were said. The master and ignition switches were turned on, and the engine batteries were tested. Steele signaled the ground crew to connect the external generator to help with the engine start. The Meat Hound's hydraulic pumps got to pressure and kicked off. Jones set the parking brake and continued to call out the checklist. Jones checked the fuel gauges. The superchargers were in off position, and the props were set at low pitch angles. The cowl flaps were opened and locked. Throttle open, just enough to run 1,000 RPMs. Start number 1 engine. Jones held the starter switch down with his left hand and primed the engine pump with his right. Steele adjusted the mixture control. The mesh switch was held down, and Jones continued to prime the number 1 engine. The Meat Hound's right cyclone engine sputtered, spun, and went into full rotation with that distinctive sound. Jones watched the oil pressure rise. Steele had an eye on the RPMs. The Meat Hound's number 1 engine was good, so Steele said, "Let's start the second engine." The process was repeated, and the number 2 fired up, and the vacuum gauge was checked, as was the flight indicator, the oil pressure, fuel pressure, and the RPMs. Steele and Jones ran the engines to 2,500 RPM to check the superchargers, and they were all good. Steele backed off the engines, and they waited their turn as Jones returned the checklist to its folder. The 368th Squadron was leading the pack on this dreary day with the capable and highly respected Captain Mac McKay with Lieutenant Reber by his side. The 368 launches 5 aircraft and established 2 elements of the lead middle height section of the bomb group. Following Captain McKay are Lally and Judas in 467, the Grim Reaper, Galogly and Piper in 507 Yankee Raider, Smiley and Miller in 466, a no-named F-Beauty, and lastly, Silos and Kramarenko in 498 Dark Horse. What a fine group of men and planes. You know their mothers must have been very proud of them. The next squadron off the ground were the 4 aircraft of the Clay Pigeons, and they were being led by Captain Rader. Captain Rader is flying aircraft 42, 5431, our friend Little Abner. They are followed out by Lieutenants Fortin and Farnell in 425994. This is the plane number on the mission report, but according to Roger Freeman in the B-17 Flying Fortress story, that aircraft is not built until June of 1943, and then it's delivered to the 383rd Bomb Squadron. So there you go, another mystery. Fisher and McKern take off next in 425072, another no-named F-Beauty. Then come Hayward and Clymer in 407 Fightin' Pappy. This squadron was in the high position on the right side of the formation, and they snuggled up tight and circled the airfield, waiting for the rest of the bomb group. The 5 aircraft of the Grim Reapers, the 423rd Squadron, were up next. They were on the runway, and they were led by Lieutenant Robert Smith and Kennedy as his co-pilot in aircraft 425180, Steele's first mission aircraft, the DFC. Note, It looks like DFC, I'm calling this out just so I can remember it, is shot down on June 25th, 1943 on Steele's last mission. So if I have that correct, wouldn't that be crazy as he sat in the tailgun position watching his very first mission plane go down? More on that later. Following Robert Smith in the DFC are Lieutenants O'Hara and Smith in 425720, the Scarlet, of course. Lieutenants Check and Wigington are flying 425218 Skywolf, and today they launch and they circle the airfield. The Meat Hound was next. She sat at the end of the runway with a foot on the brake. Steele was staring down the runway, then at the gauges. Jones was staring at the gauges, then down the runway. The crew were nestled in their spots, talking to God or whoever would listen. With each mission, the crew knew they were pushing their luck because statistics don't lie. It was time. The foot came off the brake, and the Meat Hound slowly lurched forward. Then Steele applied the pressure to the throttles, and the Meat Hound slowly gained speed. Jones was calling out the airspeed, 30, 40, 60. It felt like a lifetime. 90, 95, 100, near the end of the runway as the Meat Hound gains altitude and Steele pulls back. Airspeed was good, wheels up, and as they rolled up, Steele banked the Meat Hound, looking for his slot next to the Skywolf. The Meat Hound tucks into position on the right side of the formation, closely followed by Lieutenants Hopkins and Pip in 425422, a no-name deaf beauty. The Grim Reapers were in formation, and they were waiting for the last squadron to join them. The last squadron drew the Purple Heart corner lot, which was no prize indeed. The 369th had earned that position today, and they were led by Lieutenants Howard and Holstrom in 425729 Piccadilly Commando, which leads me to think someone had a really good time in Piccadilly, so much so they named the plane after it. Lieutenants Malazewski and Watson were in the number 2, flying 425404 Giesel with the infamous Wild Bill Casey and Ross piloting the Banshee 2. I think there are enough stories about Wild Bill Casey for him to have his own book. The second element of the 369th consisted of Riordan and Haas, and one of our favorites, Wahoo 2. In their pocket, flying the number 2, were Mergoffen and Weimel in 4229477, Joan of Arc. That was McGoffin again. And in the number 3 is a crew we are all familiar with, and you're probably already calling them out. Hennessy and Littlejohn back in their regularly scheduled aircraft, Little Audrey. These were the aircraft and the crews of the 306 Bomb Group who were flying with Steele and Jones, Simmons, Hull, McLennan, Stymax, Piotrowski, Durham, Bevan, Smoot, and the Meat Hound on this 43rd mission for the 8th Air Force. Speaking of mission numbers, 306 Bomb Group Surgeon Thurman Schuller continues to push his campaign for a limited number of missions due to the strain on the crews, especially as some crews are getting into the mid-teens. The weather was not great and would have an effect on the mission like so many missions before, but this time the impact was probably felt more so on the French citizens than the bomber crews due to the errant bomb drops that were about to happen. Steele had the Meat Hound tucked in and she was flying good. The controls were tight, so the biggest problem for Steele and Jones was the weather. The B-17F was a 2-pilot aircraft, but Steele had command today, so the decisions were on him. The bomb group continued to gain altitude, and they were still all together. No aborts so far. They were approaching Dungeness and the English Channel, and Steele was hoping to see the rendezvous with the Spitfires. It is not clear when Steele got to see those beautiful birds of prey, but he did make a note that he saw them. As a pilot and crew, having fighter support was truly a godsend, and it was much better than fighting the Luftwaffe alone. Sergeant Piotrowski worked his way into the ball turret, that tight death trap that it was, with the only solace being the twin Browning machine guns. Walter gave the guns a test, and the Meat Hound's crew could feel her vibrate with success. The others joined in, McLennan from the top turret, Smoot from the tail, then Bevan and Durham from the waist. The Meat Hound was well defended, and all of the guns were working this day. The Meat Hound was headed for the French coast, but it already felt like a bit of a cluster, as Simmons was complaining about the navigation, but the bomb group was playing follow the leader. They crossed 10,000 feet, and the oxygen came on. The interphone was working, and the radio chatter was light, not necessarily because it was verboten, but more so there really was no necessity for it today. The bomb group got to altitude, and the French coast was in sight. Those Abbeville boys were close, so Steele was expecting one of those infamous Focke-Wulf 190 yellow-nosed bastard Luftwaffe greetings. Steele was on the interphone. "Heads up, boys. Be on the lookout." The cloud cover made everyone nervous because a yellow-nosed bastard could pop out at any second from behind those angelic clouds. Then, the nose of the Meat Hound could see it. The black carpet of death started to pepper the bomb group ahead of the 306th. Lieutenant Simmons was on the interphone, calling it in. "We are over Dieppe and well off course." Steele could see a B-17 fall out of formation and turning back for England, but he could not tell what the reason was, and only surmised it was flak. The B-17 was quickly supported by a couple of Spitfires, which has not been the usual occurrence in our story. The Wolves would not get to single her out today, or if they did, they would have to deal with her escort first. As Mac McKay led the bomb group through the new course, the cloud cover and contrails made positioning and ground target identification very difficult. Howard and Holstrom and Piccadilly Commando, who were leading the Purple Heart Squadron, got a good look at Dieppe's 6-gun flak battery and were thinking, "We were never supposed to be over this battery. We are way off course." The Abbeville aerodrome was just kilometers away, which was the official home of Luftwaffe JG-26, who in our stories are the antagonists and responsible for the air-to-air combat that has been occurring. They were known as the Abbeville Boys, but are most often referred to in our stories as those yellow-nosed bastards. They were waiting like they always were, but today, the Spitfires, some 11 squadrons of them, would provide some counterpunch to the flying fortresses. Let me set up the mess that is about to occur. The bomb groups are under 100 kilometers from the intended target. The 306 bomb group was off course, and so since you are following the leader, that means the lead bomb groups are off course, as are the tail bomb groups. One big pack of off-target together. The visibility was poor, and the condensation off the contrails was adding to the confusion. There were several targets of opportunity, the primary being the marshalling yards at Amiens, then the rail yard at Poix, and let's not forget the aerodrome at Abbeville. Let's throw this mess into a pot and shake it up, and what we know is what we know. That means I am translating the mission reports based on what someone described to the S2, based on something that they did, or what they saw, based on where they thought they were. A fine mess indeed, Laurel, a fine mess indeed. The Meat Hound was on the right side of the bomb group with Scarlet, Skywolf, and a couple of no-named F-beauties. The cold weather suits were working, barely, and the Meat Hound's crew needed them. Steele could see the air filled with ice. You know, that thin layer of ice disguising itself as a cirrostratus cloud. The crew was as nervous as a polecat, and their eyes were all over the skies, and the slightest shadow garnered their attention. The crew knew JG-26 was near, but they also knew they had a little support from the Spits today. JG-26 did not disappoint and started picking on the lead bomb group, maybe trying to break up the whole group, or maybe they were just the first targets of opportunity. Steele joined in on the interphone, reminding everyone to keep their heads on a swivel. "Captain Detail, how does it look back there?" Steele asked Smoot. "Clear, Captain. We are in good position, and no enemy fighters." Lieutenant Simmons reported on the position. "Captain, we are still off course." "Roger that, Navigator." Steele and Jones looked at each other, but it was hard to see the smirks on their face with the oxygen mask. Lieutenant Simmons was a little put off, because if they got jumped or had engine trouble and needed to turn back, he would have to guide them home, and they were already off course. I guess that is why the navigator needed to be the smartest man on the plane. Think of it this way: if they got jumped or hit and have to turn back, the turn back is over water, and at 20,000 feet, the water looks like water and has no distinguishing features that will get you home. So you better have someone on the plane that has some idea which way is home. Not only was the 306th Bomb Group off course, hell, the whole bomb wing was off course. Even the Memphis Belle was off course. So this whole cluster was going to throw their timing way off. Steele, Jones, Hull, Simmons, and McLennan could see the flare from Captain Mac McKay's ship. They were at the initiation point, and it was time for the bomb run. Pilot to Bombardier: "We are in on the bomb run. Good luck, and let 'em have it." Steele was thinking to himself how this was the worst part of the mission: flying straight, no evasive action, and there were too many clouds around, providing cover for any yellow-nosed bastard that chose to use it. Steele knew a Focke-Wulf could come out at any time and make an attack on the Meat Hound before anyone could see them, and he was flying straight. Jones had one eye on the horizon and one eye on the instruments. "She's flying good, David. Engines and superchargers are in good shape." Sergeant Hull was focused as a hawk. He appreciated the opportunity to learn the toggle trade after Reynolds went down with Brady at the end of December. The crew thought Reynolds had been killed, but Reynolds was a POW, but no one would know it for a long time. Sergeant Hull was fixated on the lead aircraft. Come on, come on." Steele reminded the crew to stay alert and asked Smoot to provide an update, which came back as an all clear and in good position. Sergeant Hull would be toggling 6 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs, and he could not wait any longer for the release. Boy, does that sound familiar. Lieutenants Steele and Jones could see the dogfight developing in front of them. Steele was trying to stay focused on flying, but a fighter dogfight unfolding in front of you is hard to ignore. The Spitfires had jumped JG-26, or maybe JG-26 had jumped them. Either way, the Meat Hound's crew could see the melee that had ensued. The Meat Hound watched as a Spitfire went down, not by a fighter, but by the black carpet of death. Bail out, the crew said to themselves, and out loud. Steele and Jones were trying to fly straight and stay tight and be in good order and the distraction of the dogfight was what everyone wanted to see. Steele then watched as a couple of Spitfires in a cross-weave move take out an Me-109 with a blue nose, then a Focke-Wulf 190 with a yellow nose, of course, and there was a cheer from the boys. Sergeant Bevan had a keen artistic eye and was thinking he had material for his next sketch. Captain McKay had the 306 Bomb Group in good flying order, even if they were late and off course. I know that sounds funny. The bomb group is late and off course, but in good order? Indeed. Captain, I can see the railroad junction. The view was obscured, and the 8th Air Force Command was very strict about bombing German military operations only when they were in France. There was to be no indiscriminate bombing in France. In other words, only punch the Germans. Okay, Lieutenant, you make the call. And with that, Captain Mac McKay's aircraft released their bombs at 15:09 hours through the haze and the clouds. The 306 Bomb Group was executing their bomb run on the target of opportunity at Poix. Bombs away, sir, and the rest of the squadron soon followed. Whether it was a mistake or intentional, at this point it did not matter, because the bombs were away, and for the next minute the rest of the bomb group made their way over Poix, dropping and toggling alike. Sergeant Hull reported that he could see the target. Steele and Jones and the rest of the crew wished him luck, and at 15:09 hours, away the 6 1,000-pound bombs went, and the Meat Hound had made her first attack on German infrastructure. Down, the massive bombs fell in a shallow dive, further and further and further, until they crashed into the left side of the railroad junction, and Sergeant Hull watched as the 1,000-pound bombs of destruction quickly stepped through the target while witnessing great blasts that sent shockwaves tearing through the countryside. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Sergeant Hull and the Meat Hound had hit the train tracks to the left of the junction. It was not significant, but at least they hit something. The 306 Bomb Group, save one, had dropped their bombs on the railroad junction at Poix. The air crews started to pray like they always did, because they were in the middle of a bomb run. They had just unleashed hell on the town below, and Jerry would be coming to collect the tax during this very vulnerable time. So far, the Luftwaffe had their hands full with the Spitfires, or they were at least engaged enough not to bother the 306th. All was good in the 306th, but not all had dropped their bombs. The Wahoo II had made other plans. First Lieutenant Gerald D. Rotter, an experienced bombardier, had held the Wahoo's munitions, and there was no note as to why. Maybe he knew Poix and wanted to drop on Amiens, since it was supposed to be the primary. There is no detailed explanation, but it is highly likely that Lieutenant Rotter did not have a good sight on the target, so he chose not to drop indiscriminately. That meant the 306 was going to get to go through a second bomb run, and the crews said, "Wait, what?" The 306 was 5 minutes from Amiens, and they had one plane that needed to deliver her babies. Captain Mac McKay and Lieutenant Reber had nothing new to report. They were following the air wing to Amiens. The gunners continued to be nervous, and there was a lot of chatter on the interphone. Lieutenant Galogly, captaining Yankee Raider, tucked in behind the lead element, had a good view of the front, and watched as a Spitfire and a Focke-Wulf 190 became engaged. The Focke-Wulf 190 was an excellent aircraft, and had entered the war putting the Allied aircraft on notice that she was a force to reckon with, and today was no different as she dispatched of the poor Spitfire and her pilot as the crew of the Yankee Raider reacted with curses. Steele once again prepared the crew for a bomb run, but this time Sergeant Hull would be manning a Browning in aid in the Meat Hound's defense, since her packages had already been delivered. Steele and Jones watched as the Spitfires kept up their weaving and dogged pursuits that were thoroughly tying up JG-26 and her excellent pilots and aircraft. The air wing cruised into Amiens. Steele could see a lot of white flak trying to dispatch of them, but the fact was, Steele thought it was barely noticeable, but still enough of a distraction to put one on edge. Once again, Steele and Jones alerted the crew as the bomb group started a second bomb run, this time for the Wahoo. At 1516 hours on the afternoon of March 13, 1943, the Wahoo were bombs away, and the Meat Hound watched as Lieutenant Rotter delivered the payload that fell short but walked their way in with little to no effect on the marshalling yards. Captain McKay banked the 306 out of the line of battle, and they headed for England. Steele and Jones guided the Meat Hound through the bank, and Steele started to drop her nose as the bomb group started a pretty accelerated descent. What for? The flak was nearly non-existent this day. Lieutenants Smiley and Miller and their no-named F-Beauty were cursing at the lead and wondering what was going on. A descent was 1,000 feet a minute and entirely too fast, especially gauging the lack of flak. Steele kept the Meat Hound in a tight descent, and the condensation off the aircraft in front of them was blinding. The descent seemed aggressive, and it hopefully was not problematic for any of the aircraft, because being separated in banks and descent was like blood in the water to the sharks. Lieutenants Smiley and Miller were now highly irritated, but they certainly were not going to say anything to Captain McKay, that's for sure. The 306th Bomb Group approached the coast near Les Tréport and encountered another 6-gun battery. Christ, can we not fly around those things? A call came over the interphone. Steele felt like the Meat Hound was in slow motion as she ran the 6-gun gauntlet. There was relief when they were past it, and now they were over the open water, and Steele could see the Spitfire escort. Captain to navigator, what is the bearing for Beachy Head? Lieutenant Simmons obliged. James Smoot from his tailgun position continued to provide the eyes in the back of the head, reporting on the rest of the formation and the lack of Jerry's presence. The trip over the English Channel was pretty quick, but it felt like the last 30 minutes of a 5-hour car ride when the kids keep asking, "Are we there yet?" The bomb group started to disperse and head for their respected airfields. This was when accidents occurred. Pilots and crews would let their guards down, or they would get tired, and that is when accidents happened. Jones and Steele knew that all too well, so they were a little more diligent on this day. Steele continued to bring the Meat Hound down in altitude. Then, there it was, Thurley. There would be no flares today or any priority landing, and all the ships that went out were coming home, and the ground crews loved it. The 306 made it back to Thurley with no further incidents, completing a 4-hour and 25-minute mission. The Meat Hound, the glorious art that she was, just completed her first mission, with Lieutenant Steele and Jones in the cockpit, Sergeant Hall and Lieutenant Simmons in the nose, Sergeant McLennan in the top turret, Sergeant Stymax on the radio, Sergeant Piotrowski in the ball turret, Sergeants Durham and Bevan on the waist guns, and Sergeant Smoot in the tail. It may have been a bad day of bombing, but all of the aircraft and all of the crews returned safely, which was the best kind of raid. When I started this podcast, this was the mission I was driving towards. But then I started to discover all of the neat history and stories that were associated with the 306 Bomb Group and my uncle. I met new friends and spent endless hours researching. The stories had hooked me and had me engaged. When I got to March 13th, 1943, I will admit that I was a bit let down. I wanted the Meat Hound's first mission to be this grand spectacle, but it was not. It was clean. There were all of the aircraft returned, all of the crew returned safely, and those were the missions that these young men dreamed of. So I guess in that sense, the Meat Hound got to live a dream on her first mission. I have a feeling they are not all going to end up this way. This concludes Episode 11, Meat Hound, Part 3. The next episode will take us into the end of March 1943 with another raid on Wilhelmshaven. What is your connection to history? Until then, just think of the things you may find when you are looking for something else. Gaspar, out.